So the only way to truly solve the race problem in America, to narrow the wealth gap, is how you do it. So this is what I was looking at out of Market Watch, and a lot of times, believe it or not, I look at the stocks, I look at some of the economists and some of the things that they say, some of the how would you say when you're looking at um, not only politics, but what economists say in terms of the stock market and housing market and how things run. And so, out of Market Watch, the unrest in the cities across the U.S. this week is just the latest manifestation of a struggle that will continue to happen until the wealth gap between whites and blacks is addressed. And this is what black economists are saying. So when I was reading this article, it was going into the details as to why we have the wealth gap. And some of us kind of already know, and some of us are not aware of all of the different issues that have gone on historically. That's why they use the term systematic or systemic racism, or systemic reasons that have caused institutionalized racism as to the cause to why some groups are able to thrive financially, and whether like such as this COVID-19, this pandemic, you see some people are able to go to their vacation homes and move away from the city, and they have more resources financially in terms of healthcare and medicine and food. They can go for a while without having to work, or maybe they have a occupation where they can work at home, so they fair weather the storms that come when it comes to these type of disasters or national emergencies. And so it goes on to say that what is a wealth gap? So it is a stark divide between how much capital whites and blacks control. And so by one estimate, a typical white family has the wealth of 171,000, and this is nearly 10 times greater than the wealth of a black family, which only has like $17,150. And putting it another way, that's just like a comparison um, for an example. So the typical black household remains poorer than about 80% of white household families. So this stunning wealth gap between races has persisted in a good time and a bad time for the past 70 years. So it does not get any better after the civil rights era legislation was passed in 1960 or during the Obama administration. Still, things seem to remain the same, and it will continue to fuel unrest because people see that they're not really doing well, even though they may have a job, they may be able to get by from month to month, but that's all you're basically doing is getting by. You're not really accumulating wealth in the long run. So as long as the racial wealth gap continues, we're going to have these type of problems. We're going to have more protests. We're going to have more incidences of racial targeting, because you still have a systemic institutions in place and systemic racism going on that, even though you don't see the signs, it isn't Jim Crow era. We're not living in slavery era, but we're living in what is called, I like to say, Michelle Alexander says it best, you have this new Jim Crow where things are coded, and we're living in this era that is colorblind, but we're still going through basically the same issues that have happened in the past up to now. And so that's what fuels a lot of these protests and civil unrest. And so the wealth gap is one of the reasons that there are protests today, said Linwood Tauheed, a professor of economics in the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the president of the National Economics Association. So I'm basically reading this article, so I don't necessarily, digressing back, want to use the phrase or phase that it is the straw that broke, the phrase that the straw that broke the camel's back. But we have lots of evidence that the economist or the economic system is not benefiting the majority of the population, he said. So basically, we see that from time and time, year and year, decade after decade, African Americans are dissatisfied with the way things are, which is rightfully so. So that's not new for us. But now you're finding college students are also dissatisfied with their futures because they can see, hey, this doesn't look good even before they even get started. So, the COVID 19 pandemic has highlighted these issues. The fact that African Americans have a lack of resources income wise to buy necessary things like food, like your basic needs, healthcare, food, medicine, and they're suffering in greater numbers than the white counterparts or white Americans are because they're able to go to their vacation homes, they're able to buy another home, they're able to build wealth through buying homes, and they're able to sustain longevity of life because they can afford medicines when these type of incidences arise. There's certain groups that are able to do that, and others that just aren't, or larger groups that aren't, that are marginalized. So since the 1960s, the wealth gap has been largely ignored by the economics profession, Black economists have said. And so for years, Black economists struggled in the what is called the American Economics Association to even study the subject of wealth disparities. And so, some people feel that, you can just be like, I'm going to go back up here. You can be like Oprah. You can be like Denzel. You can be a basketball star. You can be a singer. You can be an activist, and you can make a lot of money. But everybody is not Oprah. Everybody's not Denzel. Everybody's not a basketball star. Everybody's not this, orator or speaker. And so you might be just a regular working class individual, but you still face these economic woes. And so this is for years what a Black economist struggled to convey to American Economics Association to even study this subject of wealth disparities between races. Black economists have said so. Universities and think tanks also didn't support the work. And so Black economists formed their own association called the National Economics Association. This was in 1969 to study the economic situation or impacts of Black Americans even up to today. So it was very difficult for Black economists to present a paper to AEA conference that was questioning whether mainstream economists were understanding the economic disparities between white and Black communities. Tauheed said so-called mainstream economists were really interested in more efficiency. Okay, so basically, people being ignored, their suffering being ignored, it's easy to ignore it when you're not living around or you're far removed from it, of course. So the wage gap is a question of equity and how to expand the pie. And so Carl Boulware, an economist professor at Wellesley University, the best way to think of wealth is to think of its power, he said. So in a statement to her membership, Friday, former Federal Reserve Chairman Janet Yellen, who is the president of AE&A, said that her organization has only begun to understand racism and its impact on our profession and our discipline. And so this right here is the racial wealth gap. So if you look at it on the side is the right is the money that is accumulated, and at the bottom are the years, starting from 1989 all the way up to 2016. And you see in the red is Black families, and in the white is in the blue, the powder blue is the white families and how they fare financially versus Black families. And notice that in the red, the Black families are Black people that are based on year, you see how the bar is really, really low, and it's under, a certain amount of money that has been accumulated. And you want to know why the cause is? Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out, but black economists say the historical cause of the wage gap is slavery, of course. So I don't want to offend anybody, is what they said. So I don't want to be labeled a radical, but the wealth gap has its roots in the starting of America. So it's the beginning, it's the start of all of it. That's basically what I've been saying in most of my videos, that a lot of this has to do with not only just race, but it's sort of like you're at the beginning of a race, and race is not just to try to discriminate based on how you look phenotypically, but also to try to set you apart so that they can get a head start financially and stay up there and never go back. And then you will never go back, except you just stay where you're at and you stay poor. And so it starts at the root of America, which is slavery. And so Samuel Mears, the economist of the University of Minnesota, basically said this. So Jim Crow laws put in place shortly after the Civil War also kept blacks impoverished, we kept poor. And so all these cities, all these countries that people go to, and you notice that certain groups seem to not really be doing as well as other groups, like what we heard happening in Minneapolis, where a certain percentage of the population of marginalized people, black people, remain poor, or they're not really doing well financially, and that's not by accident. And there are many other cities that mirror the same thing, and that is also not by accident. And a lot of it starts from the beginning, and it's largely remains the same, and it hasn't really improved. So a more recent and complex cause of the systemic exclusion of blacks from the US housing market beginning in 1920. So how is housing important? Even if you're not talented, if you're not a musician, you're not athletically inclined, if you are in the home buying market, housing is one of the main engines of accumulating wealth in America. So restrictive covenants that were put in place on houses that limited blacks that could live in areas. Redlining, if you look that up, it limited where you could live, where you could own a home, if you were even able to be given the opportunity to own a home. So this was said by Tahid. I'm adding some things in there of my own because I've kind of went over these things, studied it myself. But these covenants, combined with discriminatory credit policies, kept blacks from building wealth. And so at the same time, government policies were put in place to assist whites to build wealth through housing, which basically was their, how would you say, affirmative action back in the days, which they fought so hard for us not to have in terms of black people. They didn't want black people having affirmative action, but somehow they were able to have their own little affirmative action, which pays really well, doesn't it? So, for instance, in Minneapolis, where the current protests began after the death of George Floyd while being detained by police, white Americans has benefited from Homestead Act. This is called the Homestead Act. The white soldiers coming from the World War II. Okay, this was dating back to then, where they were given cheap loans to buy homes in the surrounding suburbs. So that's, I coined it, what I say, their affirmative action, or their, back then, their welfare, or people fighting for them to have wealth building and opportunities, which weren't given to black Americans the same. So these neighborhoods were off limits to blacks back then. And probably, I wouldn't be surprised if it still remains true, said Professor Samuel Mears. So an economist professor at University of Minnesota, and the only prosperous black community in the city was razed to the ground to build a highway to St. Paul, he added. Okay, so my feeling is until and unless white people acknowledge that their wealth holdings and therefore the wealth gap is attributed to unearthing entitlements from public policies that are probably still in place today, then we're not going to even have a conversation about solutions of wealth gap, Professor Mayer said. Okay, so the solutions black economists think that the reparations, the direct payments of descendants of former slaves would narrow the wealth gap. They're also agreeing with that, but they are under no illusion that this policy could easily become law as blacks make up 12% of the population. So reparations run into conflict with American mythology of how you get ahead, which says that it's all individual effort. Okay, said the Professor Mason from Florida State. So Senator Cory Booker, the black U.S. Senator that we hear now, um, from New Jersey, pushed for baby bonds during his brief run for presidency last year. And so the accounts presented that at birth, they would be seeded $1,000 and receive 2,000 extra every year, depending on the family income. So they would only be used once the child reaches age 18, with the funds limited for paying college, a home, and to start a business as well. So those opportunities to have that there, because having wealth in your family also, if you're able to pass that on to your kids, their kids will benefit from that. And so you have a lot of people that I'm just going to get off this. You hear some, haven't you heard, some people have heard, well, I didn't put you in chains. We didn't do the slavery. We're not putting the signs up saying you can't eat and you can't go anywhere. You have opportunities. You have schools. We're not slave owners. It's not our fault. We didn't do it, but you're benefiting off of what had happened from way back when, and you're doing a lot better, and you are silent about it, and you're just benefiting off of it and reaping the rewards from what maybe your great 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 grandpa or grandma or grandfather has done. And so that doesn't make it any better to watch people suffer and fall from the wayside. And now we got a pandemic. You can see the clear cut um, differences in terms of the wealth gap. And so that doesn't make it right either. And so this idea is race neutral, and poor whites would benefit the most from such a program, Professor Mayer noted. And so I don't really think that in the final analysis, baby bonds are going to dramatically narrow the wealth gap, but I really am happy, or really, it would really, I'd be really happy if I am wrong, Mayer said. And so basically, that is a short article. I just wanted to put that out there. There's been more articles that have surfaced having to do with this issue. So you see underneath, you see like maybe it looked like a project housing. And so there are other articles. Blacks are poor relative to whites. Nothing has changed in 70 years. You've seen all these movements, all these protests. This just came out, guys. So I'm just basically going to go to another article that is in relation to this, because I thought closing the racial wealth gap should be the big focus right now. The racial divide, or racial wealth divide. So these issues are popping up because they've always been the reason, or the root cause as to why we keep having the same situations over and over again. American investors who want to do something about injustices are basically out of luck. That's something unrelated. I don't think that's the same thing. So that seems to be the root cause as to why these things are happening. Michigan State University Professor Lisa Cook joins Yahoo Finance's On the Move panel to express the shortage of uh, black economists and its impact on communities. And so these issues are going to continue to happen if you have people that don't admit that the reason why people are suffering. The reason why you have more people that have a lack of health care and resources is because of the root cause of what started all of this. People want to say, oh, that happened a long time ago. That's because you're benefiting from a system that happened a long time ago. You're doing well, and there's many other families that aren't doing well, and they're not benefiting off of anything except poverty. And so that's something I think people should really take into consideration, that you've got some people that can just, sit in a house and they complain about, oh, I can't go shopping and get a haircut. But you got another family over here, they're complaining, which is legitimate. They can't go shopping and buy groceries because they can't eat. There's a difference here, guys. And so, with having said that, I'm going to let this video go. Like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for listening.